Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. Every Wednesday, hobbyists to full-time professional photographers meet here to connect, inspire, and create. Our guest speakers share images, photography tips, and their stories of inspiration that help you improve your own photography skills. The schedule for our upcoming presentations is on my website at lindanickell.com, as well as the links to previous sessions on my YouTube channel. Tonight's guest is Valerie Hoffman. A nature and landscape photographer based in Pennsylvania. This is Valerie's fifth presentation for the Happiness Hour. In tonight's presentation, Compose More Creatively, Valerie will talk about what it takes to create more compelling images. She'll share simple tips and techniques to help expand your creative vision and encourage you to approach your compositions more thoughtfully and artistically. If you're on Instagram, look for her at Valerie Hoffman Photography, and her website is valeriehoffmanphotography.com. Welcome back to the Happiness Hour, Valerie.
Thanks so much, Linda. And hello, everyone. Good to see you all again.
So you were here just about a month ago, and one of the cool things, I'm just going to say this, is that because you've been doing presentations for me from the start, it was kind of cool for you to be in Texas and see my playground and get to meet a lot of these people that you've met through the Happiness Hour.
No doubt. I mean, that was a real highlight. I mean, just in the whole couple of years, I've felt like it's close relationships, even though you've never actually seen anybody. And so when we did see each other in person, it was just like you knew each other for a long time. It was great. I loved it.
Well, I appreciated that you came and you did the live in-person Happiness Hour at the festival. And it was definitely a highlight to have you here. All right. You ready to jump?
I am.
It was.
Yeah. That you'll have to give me a little grace. Between the combination of like allergy tablets and this and that, I feel like I'm really dry. So I'm going to have to keep sipping as we go. I feel like I'm totally tongue-tied trying to go through it, but I'll do the best I can. I could have used that other 4 weeks I had coming,
I'll just lay the groundwork. Valerie was not my scheduled speaker tonight. I had my speaker that was scheduled, Gina Yao, is ill. And so I just told her, let me find somebody to switch. And Valerie was very gracious to say, I can do it. But I know that you scrambled to put this together, and I appreciate it. But you're a pro. You
give me some grace.
I'm going to give you grace. Go ahead. All right, get started.
Well, the rest of them too. So, all right. So yeah, the whole thing being there, I just want to say a couple things before we jump right into them, but it was fantastic to be there and I had a great time. One of the things that, like, the evening of the Happiness Hour, the live Happiness Hour, I had several people text me, Christy being one of them, and saying, oh, I'm so sorry I missed your presentation. And like, well, unless you were going to be here in Texas, you were going to miss it. So it wasn't recorded. And so knowing that, and knowing that even some of the people that were at the Georgetown Photo Festival, there was so much going on at once. I know not everybody, didn't see it. So I am kind of recapping some things, maybe with some different images, and then adding a bunch more tips from there. So that's kind of how we're going to get started. But, talking about composition, in my opinion, I think composition trumps all other aspects of photography. Some people might say light, whatever, timing maybe, but I really think that composition makes all the difference, because you can have, if you have a very well, compellingly composed image, you can have bad light or some other things and still, have a magnificent image. So, light and subject and timing and exposure, all of that matter, but I really think composition is key. And as a workshop instructor, it's one of the things that I see people struggle with the most, but don't realize that it's, that they're not doing very well with it. So hopefully some of these tips can, help you with that. I think before we begin, we should define composition. There are a lot of different things out there, but one of the definitions that I like the best is just the arrangement of elements in an image. And I just talked about some of those elements like light, shape, and color, pattern, texture, all of those things. They're the building blocks of images, and they're the kind of things that you kind of move together with composition. But as an artist, which is what you are as a photographer, you're the creator of the image and you're the master storyteller. And so your images reflect who you are and what you're feeling. And so how you compose your images really should, kind of reflect you and the mood and what you want to convey, the story that you want to tell. So you really want to think about that. So let me kind of get in here to some of these key elements. So starting with the most obvious, if you've heard any rules or whatever, rule of thirds comes up all the time. And when I first mentioned it before, Linda's like rolling her eyes, like everybody knows the rule of thirds. Well, maybe everybody's heard of it, but I can say that people don't, even think about it sometimes when you're composing. So just like starting here at this kind of very important one is that you're kind of dividing your image into thirds, 1/3, vertically and horizontally. And I'll show you that when we get in here. And the idea is to put your subject not in the dead center, but on one of those 4 intersecting points. And that gives a much more pleasing look to your images. So, I try and stress that you do your composition in camera, but you can do some tweaks in post-processing as well. So let's kind of look at, sorry if I start sharing now, Miss Linda.
Absolutely. This is the Valerie show. You can do almost anything you want.
Wow, you didn't mention that before.
It's limited. Go for it.
All right, so here's an image, and this was actually the first I shot, and I have my subject dead center. So I have the same amount of sky in the image as I do in the rocks, and that just felt right when I first did it, but it's not the most pleasing composition. And when you have a scene, you want to decide where is the greater impact maybe in the image. Is it in the sky? Is it in the foreground? For me, I really loved these rocks and the way they were leading, kind of up to the lighthouse. So they were the primary thing that caused me to climb all the way down there on these sharp rocks to get there. And so I recomposed the image. Now having them take up 2/3 of the scene, and then just the sky, the upper 1/3. And I think that has a much greater impact. And then you kind of have these lines that just point you right up there. And then also using a wide angle lens and being low, that perspective also just really helps, direct your eye. And it's way more pleasing than if everything had just been kind of dead center. So, definitely get your horizon out of the center. On this one, you've got the horizon. Now the sky for me was where all the action was. So that took the upper 2/3. And then I composed so that this fog house, and this is on the Michigan coast, that was on my intersecting point with these giant waves that were crashing over in high winds. So instead of just centering that, and then that would have kind of cut off the actual lighthouse, moved that over to one of the points. In this really simple snow scene, again, I was drawn to the bench and the simplicity of it and the peacefulness, putting that bench over on where that, and I can't, now that we just decided, oh, there we go, that we were going to do the full frame. You can see now, here are the crop lines, and you see what I mean now. And let me go back with, let me do one more too, so you can see it maybe a little better, if this would work. So kind of the thirds right here, and moving the fog house and the waves right over to one of those points. And you could see that I did do that, a little bit of cropping in the actual in post-processing. So just moving that over gives for a little more pleasing image. But, you know, another kind of tip for composition, or, you know, people say learn the rules and then break them. Here's an example where I think actually centering the subject has more impact. Shooting a lighthouse in New Jersey with Christy from New Jersey. And, you know, I loved the way the clouds were kind of, you know, arching overneath and kind of under, so almost like framing it. And so I think actually centering this and not having it off center has more impact in this image. And then the same with this later as the sun set or was setting, it just was huge as it was touching the water. It was really cool. This was with a 400mm lens. And so all the actions in the sky, so that takes up the upper 2/3 or more. But I thought having the sun dead center actually worked here. So, you know, don't just do something because it's a rule, do what feels balanced and right for your particular image. And my first bird image here, we were photographing a full moon or a moonrise at this wildlife preserve where at this point there were tons of snow geese migrating, and I was hoping to capture some snow geese, you know, in front of the moon. And when I got home, you know, I was just firing every time something flew there. And when I got home, I realized that I had caught a heron there. But I think it works just dead center. I think it just has a good flow to it. It would look very awkward if you tried to put that in one of the rule of thirds points. So, you know, you can break that rule. Another tip would be leading lines. You know, you always want to look for lines in an image. They can be very graphical. They can add huge impact. In this case, the stairway had tons of lines from the stairs and the railings, the lines going up and down with the metal in between and the colors. So look for those when you approach a scene and see if there's something, some way that you can incorporate them. Because lines in an image are used to direct the viewer's eye, like in this case, in the Valley of Fire, and this nice winding road just kind of leads you through the scene. And eventually I feel like just visually, I end up at this mountain in the background. And your lines can be, they can be straight, they can be curvy, they can be, you know, circles, whatever, but they definitely have a huge impact on your image. So, you know, look for them in the scene. Here also in Valley of Fire, Linda and I took turns standing in the middle of the road so as not to be killed because you couldn't see any traffic. You were at the top of the hill. And I just loved this, how it led again through the scene. And it just makes for a much more visually interesting image. Hello. Here we were on a pier and we were shooting the sunset and, you know, doing really long exposures in the water. And when I looked over, I had noticed that these beautiful lamps, and obviously this was at Christmas, these lamps had just turned on, and I quick ran off the pier and, you know, wanted to try and incorporate them and this, you know, beautiful sidewalk, which leads you right, you know, kind of into the sunset. And that's another thing. Your lines actually should lead somewhere interesting in the picture. They shouldn't just lead like out of the frame. They shouldn't lead to a trash can or something else, but it should be a visually pleasing journey for the viewer's eye to wander through your image. In this case, using a super wide angle lens, we're in a train, and which is just stunningly beautiful, but just look at the lines from all the architectural elements throughout the train. And that I think is just really powerful in drawing your eye through those lamps and down to this beautiful stained glass window in the back there. So that's something definitely when I'm doing any kind of architecture that I'm looking for ways to lead your eye through the scene. So another tip to kind of look for is to try and create depth in your images. You know, you have a three-dimensional scene in front of you that is now getting, you know, squished into kind of this one-dimensional image. And how do you get that to look dynamic again, like what you were seeing when you were standing there? So one of the things that you can do, especially in your landscape photos, to create that depth again, is to have a good foreground, a middle ground, and a background element that kind of, where it kind of gives the depth for you. So I found these really neat rocks that I decided to set up on and kind of get a little low. And then we had this midsection where the waves were crashing over the rocks. And then in the background, you had the lighthouse. And I certainly have pictures of just that little island with the lighthouse, but the more compelling images are these that have the foreground, middle ground, and background. So I have a couple examples of that as soon as Zoom lets my cursor go. There we go. So here's another one in South Africa, and you've got these strong rock formations in the foreground, and then also the formations in the middle, and then all the way to the back, and then the sky and the line, the ocean line. And that just gives a strong feeling of depth. Another one, this was a funny thing, in the Valley of Fire, we had gone to this very photographed place, and there were two young ladies like taking turns taking pictures of each other. And, instead of standing there with my hands on my hip waiting, like, will you just get out of the scene, which is probably my first, feeling, I looked, I'm like, wait a minute, they're the picture. And so this young lady in the foreground, kind of anchors the scene. And then you have her friend that she's taking a picture of back here in the middle ground. And then you have this kind of mountain. And then you have the road as a leading line, like taking you through. And I think this just has a very nice feel. It's kind of very, I think it has a nice dramatic feel to it. And sometimes people can actually add to your images and not take away from them. Another one where I have, I just got low enough that I could have the flowers in the foreground. And then in the middle ground is on the other side of this little watered floor area, the other flowers in these along the railing. And then you kind of have this nice doorway, and you feel like you just kind of go through and wander off into, whatever your mind perceives might be there, but you can feel the depth there. And then, branching out from that, let's talk about just the foreground. So if your foreground can really make or break your image. In this case, in the summer, I was at the Pennsylvania State Capitol and walked around the back of it, and there were just these beautiful flowers there. And so with a wide angle lens, I just got low and let them take up a huge portion of the scene, and then just having the rest of the Capitol in the background. And I think that really adds a lot to that image, having those flowers there.
Hey, Valerie, before you go to your next couple of shots, which is fine. Susan is curious, what f-stops are you using for those foreground, middle ground, background shots?
So for those where you want depth, you probably want everything in focus. And so I would be at least at f11 or 16. And especially the ones with the water, I was probably at least at f16. And I could pull those up. I just can't stay in the full screen there. But I'm usually almost always at f16 where I have water and I want to try and slow it down a little. And then, the same here, this was f16, if I remember correctly as well, so that I have everything from these little cone flowers right in the foreground. I think that's what they are, in the middle ground, and then all the way to the back, this continues to be sharp there.
Okay. Before you go on, a couple of questions. Carolyn's curious, what's your ISO?
I will always, I choose the native ISO, which you can look that up. A lot of people think, oh, use ISO 50 or 100, the lowest your camera will go. That's not always the best for your sensor. So whatever the native one is, that's what I choose. So in my case, I'm now using Olympus exclusively, and that native ISO is 200. Canon is also 200. I know Nikon's one. So I try and start there. And in this case, there was plenty of light. There was no issue with whether, I had a slow shutter speed. I was able to use a tripod. So 200.
And then one last question before I get you to move on. Nate's curious, are you stacking any of these shots?
None of these are stacked. So I have spent a lot of time playing with the focus bracketing and stacking in Olympus, and I absolutely love it. I will show you a little later where I did actually use that, but these were just, I didn't know how to use it then at this point. This was a couple of years ago. So,
All right.
is that good?
Yeah.
All right, so still talking about foreground. So in this case, some neat waterfalls. So you could just kind of fill the frame with the waterfall, but I love the rock formations here. I love the kind of jaggedness of them and the lines. Another thing that you could also look for, not just having this nice foreground, but this kind of forms a triangle, like an upside down triangle here, which also is kind of a mirrored flipped image of, you know, the triangle almost, it's a little distorted, that you have with the waterfall. So it just has a really neat, you can see that big like diamond if you look at it that way, kind of adds more impact. So I got really low to the ground and had myself back so I could get, you know, this nice foreground in this image. And then the same with this one, you know, super wide angle, the lens was almost right against this rock. Yes, I put those leaves there before you ask. I couldn't find any prettier ones, so they do have spots, but they really anchor the scene. So your eye goes there first, but then, you know, it follows the lines of the water and on up into the pretty trees in the background. And that's a strong, like that makes this a much better image than just shooting the upper parts of the rocks and the water. Now, let's give a little credit or some little thought to just the middle ground. You know, in this case, the subject is the barn, but so the middle can be your main subject, but here you still have this foreground in with it, and then just kind of a soft, pleasing background. So what's in the middle of your images should have some kind of interest. In this case, the main subject is this waterfall. So that is what's the middle. I still have this nice little rock that's in the foreground, kind of anchors and kind of points you up. And then, but this strong, you know, taking up the better portion of the image is the middle. And then you kind of wander up through the steps and maybe up to the next waterfall on this trail, which is, if you're a waterfall person, come visit me. Ricketts Glen is one of the premier places to photograph waterfalls in the country, and that's 2 hours away north of me. So moving on from the middle ground, let's talk about the background. So we do a lot of workshops at car museums, and we kind of have all taken to liking to photograph the hood ornaments. And my first shot, I thought this was a very interesting ornament, but my first shot was just horrible. Like, look at all these spectral highlights from the reflections off the cars and the bright windows. And like, to me, it's a pretty distracting, unusable image. So, you know, wanting a clean background, because this image is not about chaos there, but this nice ornament, all I did was went around to the other side of the car, and I was able to line myself up with an orange vehicle behind it. And that makes all the difference. And now it's a nice, much cleaner image than that chaos that was just a minute ago. So your background should be clean. It should complement your image, like this flower. So this was over in New Jersey, and just beautiful tulips. And, you know, I found one that was kind of popped up, and I wanted to make that one kind of the main subject, but I really wanted that soft pastel-y background. So in this case, I'm shooting at a wide aperture. So I have my 180 macro on, so that'll already give a little bit of a soft background. I'm shooting at f3.5, which is the widest aperture on that. And this background is a little further away, so it just, you know, goes nice and soft. So definitely when you're thinking about your backgrounds, and you should be paying attention to them for every image. How you know, have your subject relate to that is important. And if you want a non-distracting background, you'd be best to then shoot at a wider aperture. In this case, I was photographing these flowers. It was like a butterfly garden, and it was just very chaotic and distracting. And I noticed this very colorful sign in the middle. And so I just moved around to the side of the flower. So all I had was color behind my image. And that is a fake metal sign, or I guess a real metal sign. But it just like made that image pop so much, as opposed to all the different, you know, other stems of flowers and the fence and everything else. And the background is another thing where I really see people struggling and not paying attention. On Monday, I took this picture in Longwood Gardens in the orchid house, and there was a black pot, for some of these other flowers behind it. And I just centered myself so that I only had the black flower pot behind, this set of orchids. And it looks like a fake background or that I'm holding something up, but that's really just the way I composed the image with something that was already there. And, to answer that question, like with flowers, you kind of have to make sure that you have what you want in focus there, but have a softer background. So maybe 5.6 or 8 would be good, for this kind of scene. And then when we're talking about backgrounds, let's just talk about, looking at the edges, because, for me, I get, laser focused on my subject, which was these really neat things at what's called the ruins at Longwood Gardens, and they were lit in blue at night. And when I got home, I didn't notice this little thing poking into my scene at all. And so, you can, if you didn't see it when you're shooting, then after the fact, you can simply pop in and get your little spot removal that usually works well and just make it go away. But try and, while you're, at the scene, try and pay attention to your edges, do your edge patrol, and catch anything while you're there, because sometimes it might not, be easily removed. In this case, I was only looking at the bee and the flower here and the beautiful sunset and everything. And I totally didn't notice down here on the right that I had this flower cut in half. But once I looked at my image, looking at it, seeing that all I had to do was just zoom in a little bit closer, or maybe you can move in 1 foot, you can, zoom with your feet, not just your lens. And now that's gone, and it's a much more pleasing image. That was just kind of distracting there to the eye. So just watch for those things when you're working on your backgrounds. Here's just one more. See, I do shoot birds every now and then, but at this rookery, it was kind of hard. There's trees and bushes everywhere. And this really bugged me, this part up here in the left in the sky. And so just simply cropping in a little bit more. And I did have to do that in post-processing because I was at the max that my lens could get, but eliminate it, because that's a much more powerful image than something that has all these distracting elements in the back of the composition. All right. So another tip is to look for framing. Even if you have, like, framing is great if you have an ugly bald sky or there's something, else that you want to cover up, but it can be really nice with a pretty sky as well. So Reading, PA, we have a little mountain that we're at the base of, and there's a pagoda at the top of that. And it's a very, neat architectural element. I like to go up there a lot and photograph it. And here I'm shooting from down underneath a cherry blossom tree. No, Angie, it's not now. This was a couple of years ago. But so looking up and having that framing out the sky just made for a more compelling image. And then I noticed that the moon was rising, that, right there as well, and kind of incorporated that in. So definitely where you can, look for framing to, add a really neat element to your images. Here, framing the fountain, and you just kind of have the neat glow within that archway from the luminaries. Here's one where I stumbled across this really weird and kind of wicked sharp, thorny bush. And so I used that to kind of frame the chimes tower at Longwood Gardens. And I thought it was really neat. Now here's, another question with aperture. What aperture do I use? Well, I tried a couple different ways, and where you focus matters too. So in this case, I decided focusing on the thorns really was the most important element, because when they were blurry, it just looked terrible. And I used f8 so that you could still see the tower, but it's, kind of soft, which keeps all my attention right here on my element that I'm actually framing with, if that kind of helps. And I think this was the last one with that. We had a snowstorm, I don't know, like a day or two before I went to Texas. And I quick went over to this Red Bridge area that's a couple miles away, and, just framed that in with all the beautiful snow on the trees. And then one of the other things that people fail to do is get close enough or fill the frame and get rid of anything that's distracting. So, that's something that I say so much. It's just fill your frame with what it is, what's the subject, what matters to you. And for a peacock, what's really our draw with the peacock? They're crazy feathers, all the textures and patterns and everything. So why not wait till that bird is strutting his stuff and just get right in front there and let that just be a beautiful kind of background there. And lion, we go to zoos and we're photographing these lions, and I was drawn to, the way he's just like staring me down. Then when he stuck his tongue out, like he pretty much looked like he was going to eat me. But I just really zoomed in tight to just the face because nothing else really mattered. It was all about those eyes and the tongue. Just get rid of all the other distracting elements. And, when you have something crazy like 100,000 plus birds in flight, so these are the snow geese that we get, just shoot into them and fill the frame. Like that has so much more impact because it makes you as a viewer wonder, like, how many are there? Do they go on forever? Whatever. And this would be like a killer puzzle too. And then here, shooting the sunflower, it's early morning, I noticed this beautiful drop. And I thought that I was getting closer. I now don't have the full flower. I just am focusing in on this drop. But, could you get closer? Could you have more impact? Well, let's try. And here, if my image is now all about the drop and kind of the reflection of the blue sky, then let's get closer and fill the frame with just that element. And again, this is the 180 macro. I'm really close to that subject. So everything in the background with, the widest aperture just goes really nice and soft. This tulip, I was just drawn to the red edge. So you don't need the whole flower. You don't need the stem and the dirt on the ground, just getting close to really what's catching your eye. And for me, it was the red edge and then that little bit of water that I did squirt on. See, I'm telling you my secrets. Magnolia bloom, they're only so big, but I noticed this one petal that had this really pretty curve and I decided just to focus in on that. And it's kind of an abstract. It has a neat element. So filling the frame definitely can add more impact with your images. And then, another really basic thing to think about, a lot of us get stuck with our camera orientation and we mainly shoot kind of horizontal images or landscape images. But, I would always try a vertical image, even if you don't think that it would work right. So here, this was, obviously done in post-processing, but I think the vertical has a lot more impact than the horizontal. And in this case, I was shooting this really pretty sunset in Santa Barbara, and it screamed horizontal image to me, but I thought, all right, I'm going to try a vertical too. And I really loved that equally as much. So don't be afraid to be taking, one of each or more. And I try to always challenge people to do at least 5 different compositions before moving on, because usually the second or third or fourth as you're, moving around will give you a much better image than whatever you started with. All right, so now here's some newer maybe tips or things to think about, but look for minimalism, look for something simple. Lone trees on a hill or in a field can be, very strong compositional elements, and even more so when you have snow or fog. So I don't know how much fog or mist you guys get in Texas or wherever else everybody is, but definitely that's a good time to get out because it gets rid of all the distracting elements in the background of your landscape scene, and it just keeps it simple. So it's just a tree and this, soft, white, foggy background. And, here I'm in a field of canola, and I wanted to just keep it really simple instead of all this chaos with all these stems. And so shot with the lens wide open and got really close to that one bloom that you see popping up there in focus. And then even shot through some right in the foreground so that you just really had one thing that was sharp or mainly sharp that you were looking at. And it's just a field of yellow. I call it fields of gold. another lone tree. And I even waited till this, what is it, a cloud, kind of blew right behind it and just kind of centered itself almost on there. But really nice and simple. You've got the ground in the lower third, all the beauty in the sky. And I think that one even works centered. So center or not, but they make great elements. And then another thing that you could do to really add impact for your images is to work on perspective and change the perspective by changing your own camera position and also with what lenses you use. So in this case, I think this has much more impact because I used a wide angle lens and I had the camera right down on the concrete here. So, and then I lined up right on that line, which was pointing to this building. And I picked this because I thought it was neat with the yellow building and the yellow line, like they just really work together. But using that wide angle, getting low, made the line much more powerful pointing up to that building. And then getting, I like to try and get really low when you're shooting tulips or some other flowers with the longer stems. This is a fisheye lens. And I pre-focus it right to about a foot away and then just kind of reach as far as I can down towards the ground under the tulips and just start shooting. And I try and point towards the sun so I get that starburst in there. And it just gives these beautiful backlit flowers. And it's a totally different perspective because most of us don't spend time like laying under flowers. So it's just different than what the eye would now normally see when you're walking around these flowers. And here in this cathedral in New York, super wide angle lens, and I'm just standing there pointing straight up and I can see both ends of the church, the front and the back. And then notice how that, wide angle, it just really distorts the lines from the columns and in the ceiling. It kind of all points together. And it just is a really kind of graphically pleasing image, which is helped by the lower camera angle and that wide angle. And for this kind of scene too, I would be at least at f8 or 11. Again, wide angle, low to the ground, that really helps accentuate these lines that lead up to the train. So your lens choice and where you decide to stand really has impact. This one, again, really wide angle lens, back of this car, it really brought out that fin in the car and made it seem even that much bigger than it was. And this is art, it's not a real perspective of what the car is, but I think it's a much more, fascinating or compelling rendition of that. And then this is one of my favorite perspective images where I was at a zoo and I noticed that these giraffes were standing there at the feeding platform just with their tongues out waiting for somebody to put a little cracker on there. And instead of, my big telephoto that I had on, I quick switched to this wide angle and got right up in his face, and it just really distorts it. And I just think it's like a hysterical perspective of this guy and his tongue. And your perspective can really kind of skew the elements in the image. So obviously this stack of rocks isn't almost the same height as the lighthouse, but again, getting in low and getting in front of that can, change that perspective and, just make you kind of think more. It adds more impact to it. And I think the last one in here, this was really low, a low camera angle in this abandoned train. Really helped to accentuate what drew my eye, which was the lines in here from the seats and then the shadows across the floor. So maybe your eye starts here and you got the lines that point over to here and then the light hitting them. And then that kind of leads you straight down through the doorway. So this low perspective, really helps to, make you feel, and it was a little bit of a telephoto, so not wide angle, just really helps to kind of compress and accentuate the scene. Now let's talk about balance. So if you look at this image, I somehow thought this was good when I photographed it, but looking at it later, like it totally feels unbalanced to me because there's way more flowers on the left than there are on the right. and my little path here is not dead centered. So, for me, this is just a fail because it just doesn't feel right. So balance is something that you want to kind of pay attention to in your images. And so even though, what's on the left side of this frame is different from what's on the right side, it all kind of feels like it's balanced. Your eye takes you through this little waterway and up the little waterfall. And then you have these actually three windows in the background, and it just has a nice, pleasing feel to it. Kind of harmonious. In a lot of cases, we want to look for maybe 3 or odd numbers in flowers, but I've found that I have a lot of images that really feel balanced just with 2. So these 2 together just has a nice feel. And these soft ones are with a Lens Baby. This would be with a Lens Baby Velvet 56. And this has a nice balance. So you have these little bugs up in the upper third, on that PowerPoint there, but having still a portion of the sunflower in the lower right keeps it from feeling like the little bugs are going to knock the flower over. It just has a nice balance. And back to a lighthouse thing. Now moving back a little further and getting a little more of the pier, the lighthouse here kind of balances the fog house here, and this kind of weights, and balances that big wave. And again, that just has a nice flow to it. And now this is kind of, balance versus visual weight. This is, I don't know what you would call this, but where you would tie the rope around when you're anchoring a boat. It's obviously not even close to the same size as the giant ships at the end, but by getting really low and using a wide angle lens, it almost has the same perspective as that. I don't think I would call it a ship, but whatever it is. And it kind of balances it off, because if that wasn't there and it was just a sidewalk, the top half of the image would feel really heavy with these giant ships, but having this at the bottom helps to to give that a visual balance to it. And visual weight is something that kind of goes along in there too. So the right side of this image feels a lot heavier than the left side, because you have all this concrete on the right and not on the left. So you want to be kind of aware of, visual weight and how that balances out in your images. Here, by being low in front of these giant rocks, this foreground feels a lot heavier than what's in the background. And it just has, I think it kind of works here, but you just want to watch how your elements kind of work together. Definitely your rocks in this angle and this perspective look much bigger than the lighthouse. So if that's what you're going for, that's good. If you're trying to accentuate the lighthouse, then this would be obviously a bad choice there. Keep in mind, for when we talk about visual weight, things that are darker will automatically appear heavier than things that are lighter. And in this case too, a dark concrete bridge feels way heavier in this scene than the trees that are covered in snow. And so this feels, even though I kind of like it, it feels unbalanced to me because it feels too heavy on one side of the frame compared to the other. And I don't know, you could put in the chat whether you agree or you think it works, or, it totally doesn't work. And again, a lot of that's just how you perceive an image. But, when you talk about that weight and balance, you would also think about symmetry, and reflections are a great thing to look for. And if I have them, then I'm going to try and, if I have mirrored clouds and reflections in the water, then I want to catch both of those and kind of dead center it and let it just, do that really neat, just that symmetrical feel there or the balance. Again, more flowers that kind of intertwine, have a good balance to them. And again, I honestly looked for, a bunch of 3s, and I guess I didn't keyword them, so I couldn't come up with any images to show that odd numbers actually sometimes feel more balanced than even. But so here we're going with my even balances. And with your, still talking about symmetry, you have this hood ornament and it could feel like it's, kind of heavy to the top, but this shadow helps to, balance that out. And it adds kind of a neat visual perspective to it. And then one of the last topics, is the golden ratio or the golden spiral. You may have heard it mentioned, or the golden mean. And it's kind of, the bottom line is it's a tool that's artists use to create a more visually pleasing image. Sometimes you can start with the rule of thirds, which in this case, I think my spiral lands right on there. But it's something that just creates this beautiful flow with your subject through the scene. And it's found very much in nature. So there's a, hang on, am I still in there? There we go. So another thing that, sorry, I'm hitting all the wrong keys. If you've ever seen these nautilus shells, they're a great example of kind of this golden ratio or spiral, where you kind of have just something kind of curling around. And in some cases, it could just feel like it goes on to infinity. So I have just a couple different things that I've photographed where that has caught my eye and shot them different ways. Staircases are definitely a neat thing with not only leading lines, but maybe if you can catch them where they don't go in a circle or a square, but have this kind of like the golden spiral, can be really neat. And then one of the other things that you can look for to add some impact for your images is what is kind of known as a vanishing point, where you have these things that are kind of like these repeating patterns, but they just kind of keep going. In this case, these are these arches, which are probably about 10 feet apart, but I was standing back and used a telephoto lens and that kind of compressed them. And they just kind of keep repeating and going until eventually you do hit kind of a wall at the end. But hallways can be another good example of using the vanishing point in your composition, where you're looking down. And in this case, you can't see, anything in the end. It's just brightness. And it kind of has, and in black and white, it kind of gets eerie too, but it's just kind of a neat perspective. And then the shadows and light can really add to the image, that contrast there. Same here, just these lines that all kind of keep going and repeating, just have a lot of impact. And you can do that with anything. So at this Mack truck show, by not showing where this row ends, it kind of creates what would be, this vanishing point where you just don't know how far this line of trucks goes. And it adds a little more impact to that image, as does this, I use telephoto lens and these arches in the Pennsylvania State Capitol. And again, they just go on and on and on down the line there. And then last kind of tip is to really look for unique subjects, something that stands out. When I go to do, to photograph flowers, I don't just, jump in and start shooting, but I walk up and down and look for something that is different, unique, special, abstract maybe. And in this case, I found that there were these two tulips blooming out of the same stem, and that caught my eye. And so that was something that I photographed. Or walking a little further and found, I think this is a tulip, but the bloom not open yet, just starting to open, and how it was just kind of leaning against this other stem. And it's just different. And then this daffodil that's open with this other, kind of bloom right aside that it has yet to open. It's different. And this, I found this little daffodil kind of wrapped around underneath this tulip, and it almost looks like, it has its, covering its little mouth, like whispering or something. It just was a unique flower in the way it was wrapped around this other one that caused me to stop and want to photograph it. And then I have no idea what this is. It is a very tiny little flower, but it looks like a little Martian to me. And so again, when I saw this, it just made me stop and want to shoot it because it was just an interesting story to try and tell in nature. And this little guy at Longwood Gardens, every year they grow these Himalayan blue poppies, and apparently they're very hard to grow in non-cold areas, and they don't last very long. And so while I was photographing, I came across this guy, and I don't know whether I actually had a cold then, because it's usually in March and, seasons are starting to change. And this little guy just looked like he was so under the weather. That looks like a face to me. And his petals look like he has this little blanket wrapped around him. And, I just thought that was really interesting and a more interesting subject maybe than some of the other ones that everyone else was shooting. And then lastly, you take all those different tips and rules and whatever, and try and put them together, like more than one thing in an image. And so I call that comp stacking. But, when you can have more than one element together in an image, that starts adding even more drama or, makes a more compelling image. So in this case, I didn't see this little guy, this little person way out here until after I took the image. And now he's the wow factor for me. So even though I usually try very hard to avoid people in my images, I'm really glad that I had him here. And so now some other elements are, I have, a really strong foreground here with these rocks, and they're all sharp, but they lead, it's kind of a leading line that goes through there and leads right to this guy. But you come around and you look and you have this beautiful, like he's the middle ground. This is also some middle, and the clouds are in the middle in this beautiful background. So that has several of those elements kind of all working together in that image. And kind of this one too, use of people. I was standing there just waiting for everybody to get off the steps so I could get a clean shot of this lighthouse. But then I saw this lady in red coming up, and your eye will gravitate towards brighter colors, especially red. And so I waited till she hit what would have been that rule of thirds point and started snapping there. And, and then the steps are just this leading line that leads up there. So there's a bunch of things that are going on there that can make it, feel like a little bit more interesting image. Back to that road, here where we got really low, like setting the camera on the ground. So, now you've got the super wide perspective, you have the really low angle, you have the leading lines, you have the lines that are curving through, and it also has this strong, kind of foreground and then middle ground and background. So there's a lot of depth in this image as well. And then even, your horizons kind of split as well. So there's a lot of things here that kind of work together to make that a very interesting image. And the same kind of with this one, a wider angle, getting the lines of the little boardwalk to go out there, keeping the greater interest in the bottom 2/3 and a little bit of sky. And it just kind of points you right up there. And it feels, you could feel like the depth in there too. I think this is my last image, but this is kind of, it's the spiral, almost like the golden spiral. And it's just a staircase looking up in a building in Santa Barbara that just goes around and around, some neat use of light and shadows, the lines that kind of go through, that different perspective from looking up just is kind of more compelling than just, some different shots that were around of that building. So, oh, look at that. Well, not even exactly an hour because you yacked a lot in the beginning. So that's the end. Is everybody still there? You all asleep?
We're a little snoozing over here. No, I am here, and I was looking, I think I caught all of the questions. If you guys have any
Okay.
questions, throw them into the chat and I'll catch those. So let me get you to pull down your share screen so I can properly thank you for coming and always bailing me out at those last minutes of, oh, Valerie, we got to do this or we got to do that. And
Hang on.
you nailed it. You did good. I don't have a reason to yell at you for anything. I don't know.
Wow.
I need
Christy, do
to
you
let-
hear that? I
I
need somebody to
know.
back me up. Is Gidio? Does anybody have my back when she starts on me next time?
Oh, it's very rare. It's very rare. In fact, the last two, three conversations we've had, they've been like, hey, how's it going? Instead of me like, all right, Valerie, you need to do this, this, or this. So all I'm seeing are some very nice comments and they were well deserved. And I'm going to say one thing. The first, I think it's the car hood that you had in there. It was the one that had a lot of the bokeh. And you were like, oh, but here's another that's a cleaner version. My first reaction was like, no, I like the one full of bokeh. And then, it was like a 10-second delay. And then there were a couple other people that said the same thing. So I'm like, yes. So what works for you may not work for somebody else. And I wanted to like just put a note out there that they're both beautiful images, but the ones with the bokeh, delicious, delicious.
Well, and I guess it depends on what you're actually going for. Again, what story are you trying to tell? So if you were just trying to get a good picture of that hood ornament, that first one has a lot of distractions.
Right.
But if you want a different image, like that bokeh is pretty wild, then you could juice it up with a little more color and it's neat. So it just depends on what you're actually trying to say with your image. Because you could give a reason why anything looks good to you, you know what I mean? If you feel that way, then that's your thing, your story.
Oh, and that's what I was having a conversation with somebody earlier today that is probably going to be one of our speakers next year. So I'm hoping he's squirming.
Whoever on here better run fast.
I'm not going to disclose until I get a commitment, but pretty much I've got him scheduled in the first week of February. But it's about the story, and it's about the story that you as the photographer want to tell. And, you and I have shot shoulder to shoulder, me behind you watching for cars, you behind me watching for cars. And, later that evening we get back to the hotel and we kind of talk about the photos and we're like, were we at the same place? I mean, we were, but everybody sees something just a little bit differently. And that's what the beauty of this art that we're creating. So thank you for sharing.
And the beauty of shooting together. So, I want to give I don't know, a shout out. That sounds stupid, but it was so fun that when I came to town, like some of the other gang that are local hadn't shot together before. And, we just had so much fun. They got to see how you can get in trouble just in any situation with me. But like we were finding different things and sharing them and, oh, look at this and look at that. And a Gidio finds this. And it really helps you to learn and grow because you have this set vision from, your things and other people expand it,
Yeah.
So yeah, get out and shoot and do it with some friends.
Yeah. And it's, things, this also came up in conversation, I'm looking, I think I'm a landscape photographer that's what I love. And I'm always looking for the big picture. I'm looking for that vast landscape that's going to take somebody's breath away, take my breath away. And, I stumbled across Mika's work at one point and was like, wait a minute, she's looking at the teeny tiny parts of the world that I never notice. And, I did at one point go out and shoot with her and to watch her do her work. It's something I never considered doing. And guess what, Mika? Linda has a diffuser now. So you get excited and it challenges you to try something new and look at things differently. So I highly, highly encourage you guys, if you're especially, there's a lot of people here in Texas, and then for those that are not in Texas and you think you're coming through, kind of like tap on people's shoulder and say, hey, I'm coming through Austin. Does anybody want to shoot? I bet you could find somebody in this room to do
Hey,
that.
it's not all about Austin. So it could be
No,
about
it's
Pennsylvania. It
could
could
be
be
about.
about New Jersey, right? Christy from New Jersey.
That's
Like you're coming our way, call us up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's the beauty of it. Carolyn was in here going, I wish, I'd known you were in, I wish she said she wished she knew me when I had gone through Washington last summer. And I'm like, dang it, I wish I'd known her too. But, there's a lot of room for do-overs in our trips. So, all right, with that, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I don't think. If I did, I missed it and I'm sorry. Let me just look real quick. Nope. And with that, Valerie, you want one closing words? Anything you want to say before I shut you down?
No, I appreciate everyone being here, and I hope that I'm was able to inspire in some way or just get you to think a little bit differently or whatever. And I would love to keep in touch with you guys. So Linda, did you add my stuff, or it's on the website?
It's on the
You know,
website. Yeah,
like
everything will
how
be.
to get in touch with me and
Yep.
everything.
Give me
So,
half a second and I'll add that to my
and I
close.
promise you, if you follow me, it's more on Facebook than, maybe some stories on Instagram, but you will hear some funny stories because I managed to just have a funny story no matter what I do. So, and would love to have you if you come through Pennsylvania. So I'm in Reading, that's closer to Philadelphia than Pittsburgh, right, for sure, but come out and visit.
Okay. All right, Valerie, thank you again. Thank you for doing this. You guys, you can connect with her, Valerie Hoffman, through her website, valeriehoffmanphotography.com. She puts out a newsletter every month or so. And she also will list she calls them treks. So those are her day trips in and around Pennsylvania. So if you're interested, if you're in that area and you're interested in jumping on one of her workshops, look at her website because she keeps that current. And on Instagram, you can find her at Valerie Hoffman Photography. Next week, fine art and nature photographer and gallery owner Karen Cooper will join us from Vancouver Island, British Columbia, and Vermont-based nature photographer and the host of the Outdoor Photography Podcast, Brenda Petrella, will be here to do a Q&A session called Ask Us Anything. So if you have any questions relating to nature and landscape photography, conservation, composition, printing, and almost everything else in between, join us live and I'll put your questions in front of them and they'll help you tackle the challenges you're facing in your own photography. Until next time, go out and create something beautiful, and I hope that we see you again soon.